The objective of this section is to understand the specific technologies offered by endpoint protection software, both traditional and next generation, covering as usual the main operating systems, Windows, Mac and Linux. You will learn about methods of application control, execution prevention, whitelisting, security frameworks, and how to implement them to increase the security of the endpoint. You understand the latest trends in endpoint protection technologies such as containment, behavioral analysis, algorithmic techniques, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, all on this section. There is a collection of application and execution-based security controls that attempt to prevent the execution of malicious code. So I've bucketed them together all here in this section to discuss, as they can be very powerful at preventing malware and all forms of attack against your system. And they're also part of endpoint protection technology. Where possible, you want to use layers of application and execution controls, as we've already discussed many times, the defense in-depth approach. So what am I referring to here? I'm referring to things like access control lists, ACLs, application whitelists, anti-execution software, AV or endpoint protection application controls, UAC, digital signatures, reputation systems, parental controls, software restriction policies, and so on. So there's a lot there, and that's not a complete list. All methods to prevent the execution of malicious code on the endpoint. And what I've just run through there, these mostly use a form of application whitelisting which aims to ensure that only specifically selected objects or programs and software libraries are executed, while all other programs are prevented from executing. It can be used for both preventing malware and preventing the installation of unauthorized software by any form of hacker or whatever is trying to run things, install things that shouldn't be. It requires that you have a somewhat static operating system if you want to use application whitelisting. You would ideally want to have a common set of applications you use and not be frequently needing to install new software. If you do frequently install software and you want to try the application whitelisting approach, I would recommend you do this with the use of a virtual environment and use the application controls on your host operating system, and you can use your guest operating system to be a little bit more dynamic. So that's an option that you can potentially consider. With whitelisting, you allow a set list of applications to run, and importantly, very importantly, you deny or block all other applications in order for whitelisting to be effective. You cannot just have a whitelist without a deny all of the other programs that you don't want to have run. There is also the mirror of whitelisting, which is the concept of blacklisting. Blacklisting uses the opposite approach and blocks all known bad applications or bad objects. Any signature-based approach is a form of blacklist. Anything where you're blocking something, like a firewall that doesn't allow this port and that port, that is a form of blacklist. Any firewall that allows certain things, that's a form of a whitelist. Application and execution controls can be effective because they allow known good behavior while also attempting to block known bad behavior. They are, of course, not perfect like all solutions, so should be considered a layer of protection in your defense in depth strategy. Whitelisting has also proven not to be so popular with users because it just doesn't allow for a dynamic environment, as you can imagine. And in most cases, if it's running a business, you do get some level of rejection to it, which then means people attempt to work around it. It has proven to be a little bit problematic, whitelisting, but it does work in environments that can be more static, like a process control system. A process control system might be the sort of system that you would use on a manufacturing plant or on a gas pipeline. Those are process control systems, or nuclear power plant. They tend to be quite static, so a whitelisting approach could work quite well there. But it is possible for whitelisting or a whitelisting type approach to be implemented and work well for end users. And that has been demonstrated quite keenly with the iOS operating system on the iPhone. This has a restricted whitelisting approach, but at the same time, it has proven to be a usable environment, and the whitelisting has worked well, and the amount of malware that you get and attacks on the iOS environment is vastly, vastly lower than it is on Android. So let's think about where whitelisting would help and in what types of scenarios. Well, when you run unpatched or out-of-date software, whitelisting can help. If you are, or a person is tricked into downloading and executing something that they shouldn't, malware potentially, whitelisting will help. It will stop that file from executing, stop it from running. If you are tricked into downloading malware into a location under the control of an attacker wanting to perform DLL hijacking, whitelisting can prevent that sort of a thing. If you have a vulnerability in your system, maybe a 0-day vulnerability, and someone is trying to exploit that vulnerability and run some form of application or code, whitelisting can help there. Some more examples: attacks that commonly use auto runs. That's like when you put a CD in your drive and it automatically runs, like the Conflictor worm that you can see here. Or the LNK vulnerabilities, as was used in Stuxnet with the USBs. Attacks like these can be mitigated with whitelisting, and other attacks that use command injection type tricks. Also, some man-in-the-middle type attacks over particularly unencrypted connections like HTTP, where the file that is being downloaded is modified in transit to be something untowards. For example, using this here, the Backdoor Factory BDF, this is a tool to patch executable binaries with the attacker's desired shellcode, and the downloaded file continues to run normally, to execute normally. This could be used when when the victim is downloading something, or when you're doing a software update, the attacker can attempt to inject shellcode in there. Whitelisting can potentially help with that. The methods for bypassing various whitelisting application and execution controls constantly evolve, as you would imagine. So where might whitelisting be weak or vulnerable? Well, the ability of attacks to bypass whitelisting by exploiting the operating system have been well documented by researchers. Again, this is another type of cyber arms race. Each time an exploit to a whitelisting tool is found, improvements are made to that tool to prevent that particular exploit, and then another exploit comes out. Common exploits for circumventing whitelisting have been using things like Java, JavaScript, browser extensions, Flash, as well as built-in Windows mechanisms such as WMI and PowerShell. Those have all shown success. Also, executing malicious activities as the system or root user can bypass whitelisting, running kernel code, and using built-in Windows maintenance mechanisms like Task Scheduler, Windows accessibility tools, etc. Another weakness is when something is trusted or whitelisted as being a good application, like say your browser or its extensions, that can be used as a mechanism to bypass application whitelisting. Fileless infection. For example, the Angler exploit kit uses a newish technique in which it injects the payload directly into the exploited program's memory by creating a new thread in the exploited application. An application that will be trusted, Angler avoids dropping the file on the disk, and this payload then might download additional malware based on what it knows about the target. unless you use some other method to restrict what that trusted application can do. So there you can see there are many ways to bypass whitelisting. It's not a panacea, but a possible control for some types of environments. It will be suitable against certain threats for certain types of endpoints. Against advanced persistent threats, APTs, and custom targeted malware or professional hackers, whitelisting should not really be fully relied on because it will just be a hurdle that is likely to be able to be jumped over in some way using some trick like the ones I've described. Whitelisting is not perfect like all other solutions, so should be considered a layer of protection where you can use it. One of the simplest and most basic ways to control application execution would be through ACLs or access control lists, also user permissions. As you can see here, these are the user permissions. This is for Bob on Windows for this downloads folder here. So for example, you might set up a standard user like Bob and also have an admin user. You can see we've got a admin group here, and this user here could be an administrator, and your standard user like Bob here, he would have his permissions controlled or removed from certain files, folders, registry locations, and you can see what we've done here. So Bob can only list the contents of the download folder, so he wouldn't be able to download anything to that folder. And you might want to restrict permissions in places like the Windows folder, program files, the other program files folders, particular application folders, the downloads folder. But where you would restrict permissions would be based on your approach to hardening the operating system. We cover hardening the operating system later and standards that are out there in order to do that. But this is the basic form of application control or whitelisting. It unfortunately doesn't protect you from applications that are executed in other locations, but these permissions are implemented as part of a standard first layer of defense within operating system security. For Windows, I've written myself a tool that allows you to scan the whole operating system, well, Windows operating systems anyway, for what a user has access to. So files, folders, registry, services, etc. You can find out what a user can do. Based on this, you can then go into the files or the registry or directory and alter the permissions and remove their ability to do whatever it is you don't want them to do, read, write, execute in the area that they shouldn't need access to during normal operation. So if you're interested in having a look at this tool, this is a Windows permission identifier. You can get it at this URL here and scroll down the bottom and download it. And you'll end up with these files here. This is a sample policy file in XML, and you can install it. And there it is there. The way this works is it works based on policy, and I've included a sample policy in here. So file open, and that's a sample policy. This isn't what you should be setting or checking against. This is just a sample policy. So as an example, here we've got services. When it does a scan, it will alert if a user can do any of these things, and you can edit any of these things and add checks for whatever it is that you want. So here it will alert if there's execute permission for that user within the system root of executable files. This alerts if access is granted to this particular website, etc. And you can insert your own here. We've got registry permissions that it can check as well. So then you put in the user, and then you have to put in the password for that user. If you don't have the password of the user, what you can do is you can create a group that has the same permissions as a user that you want to check, create another user, add it to that group, and then put in the password for that. And then start. And you can see it's started scanning. So it's checking out what Bob can do. So if we look at services, and look here, it's going to tell us what Bob can do. So we can see we've got an alert there because that's against policy. And for this particular service, Bob has got more permissions than is allowed in that policy, and you can see you can read, start, stop, etc. This BitLocker service. You can also access Playboy. It's got execute permission to all of these files. So obviously they may or may not be desirable. But anyway, that's one way of checking out the permissions within Windows. Then you can modify those permissions as you see fit based on the hardening. Hardening we'll go through later. Another tool you can use for checking out permissions is Access Enum. You can also download that with Choco as well. And this is similar. You select a particular directory or registry and start scanning. This doesn't work based on policy, so that may be better or worse for you. Generally, if you're working against a policy, like on my Windows permission identifier, it's because you're working against some sort of standard, which often hardening is done against. So if we scan here, we can start to see the permissions. So there you go, that's another option. When you use permissions like this to restrict access to the operating system, this means that malware or hackers, attackers, threats then may need to escalate privilege to that of a user that has access to what it is that they need to get access to. So basically it forces them to try to do privilege escalation. ACLs are a standard first step layer of protection for operating systems. Windows as default provides ACLs that lock down access, but these are not very restrictive for the reasons of usability. But if, as standard practice, your main user is not an administrator, you will find he's quite well locked down if malware or an attacker is running under his permissions. It's certainly much better than running as an administrator or root. Another Windows-based application control is User Account Control, or UAC as people generally tend to call it. By default, UAC is automatically enabled from Windows Vista and above. The goal of UAC is to make it possible for users to run as a standard user, so not as an administrator, but yet still allow that standard user to perform admin tasks. And as we know, it's always best to run as a standard user and not as an administrator. So this is Microsoft's solution to try to get people not to run as admin. Has it been successful? No, not so much. So if we scroll down here a little bit, there's a list there. So when the user performs certain tasks, and you can see the ones here like running an application as an administrator, changes to system-wide settings, or to files in system root or program files, installing and uninstalling applications, you will get one of these, which I'm sure you're very familiar with if you've been running Windows operating systems. This is a warning to let you know that a privileged type activity is happening, and do you want to give permission to it? In the early Vista version of UAC, people found the constant pop-ups too annoying. So by Windows 7, they trimmed down those triggers, that trigger list that I've just shown you. But most people just simply click OK when it pops up because they're just so used to seeing it. It isn't really recognized in the mind as a warning that something might be wrong. So it can offer somewhat little protection in the real world in cases where people are just click happy, and most often people are quite click happy. It can of course prevent some malware, some types of attacks and hackers, or at least slow them down. But any good malware, especially if it's written for Windows, should be written to work around it. And I guess some malware will just rely on people just to click yes anyway. It is configurable. I'll show you how to configure it. If you go down to Start and then just type UAC, and then you'll find here you've got Change User Account Settings. Click on there. There are actually kind of three options. So we have the recommended option, which is always notify me when programs try to install software or make changes to my computer. I make changes to Windows settings. But if we come down to this one, it's don't notify me when I make changes to Windows settings. So that's the difference really between these two. So when you do anything, it won't notify you. But the thing is, attackers, malware run as you quite often. So therefore, really, it's useful if you are notified of any change that you do. And then this option here is really exactly the same as the other one, but it just won't dim the screen. Now really there's no point in selecting that unless for some reason your machine takes a long time to dim the screen because of some sort of graphics issue. So essentially they're pretty much the same. And then this is off. So those are your options really. Obviously recommended is to be here, unless of course you're using some other controls in order to mitigate attacks. Any malware or attacker, of course, that gains admin privileges can simply disable UAC, and they do. It is recommended to run as a standard user, as you know, as I've mentioned. For security, you do want UAC to remain on the always notify, as I've said, to add that additional layer of protection. When running as a standard user, you have the option to right click and run as an administrator, which is another form of application control. So right click, and then you have the option here to run as an administrator. I'm an administrator at the moment, but if I was not, I have the option here to run as an administrator. So that's UAC. Windows offers a feature called Software Restriction Policies, or SRP, which you can see the GUI for here. This is not available in the home versions though, which is unfortunate. It's only available in the business level versions of the Windows operating system. SRP is accessible through the local security policy if you're on a standalone PC, or in the group policy management for domain joined systems. So if you go here and if you run gpedit.msc, and you'll see here, click here, and this will be what you see. And then you've got to navigate your way through to the software restriction policies. So you need to go here onto the computer configuration, then Windows settings, then security settings, then software restriction policies, and eventually you will dig your way down to here. And this is software restriction policies. What you can see there is application control policies. Well, SRP has been somewhat superseded by this here, which is App Locker, which we're going to discuss next. But SRP is still fully usable, and in fact there are guides from Microsoft on how to use both of them together. So we're going to start by going through SRP first. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples of how you can add a rule in this in order to restrict what applications can do. So if we click here, right click, and then new path rule, and then we need to enter a path for which we want to restrict. And here what I'm going to put in is the app data folder. You can browse to a folder, of course, and then all executables within that. Security level is going to be set to disallow, and I'll add a description just to be helpful. So don't allow executables to run from within the app data folder. Okay, and essentially that is what it does. Let's create another rule. Now this time you might notice I've got two asterisks here. Now this won't allow executables to run from the immediate subfolders of app data. Got that on disallow and OK. And essentially that's the process. So the question is, well, what would be useful to block in order to prevent common threats? Well, you would want to research what you might want to restrict. You can, for example, use the Windows permission identifier that I've shown you access enum, you can use access check to find places where files can execute and choose whether or not you want to restrict those depending on what it is you are using this for, because obviously this can be used for lots of different reasons. You may be wanting to stop malware or a hacker, or this machine might be used as a kiosk, any number of reasons. So the solution is specific to the threat landscape, of course, as always. But of course, I'm going to provide you with some places to go to find some good recommendations on software restriction policies. And one of them is here, and you can download this file here. And this is essentially from the NSA. And it's the NSA's application whitelisting guide for software restriction policies. And if you scroll down here, you can find lots of guidance and specific rules on what to deny as general recommendations for blocking undesirable activity. This is also worth a read, which has some specific configurations for preventing malware, so check that one out. And another guide here, which is described as methods to stop exploit payloads and Trojans. That's also quite good if you're interested in SRP. SRP is just another recommended layer of protection, but far from perfect. Obviously, the more layers, the more hurdles an attacker has to hurdle over. Another tool for application control, or specifically application whitelisting, is AppLocker, which extends the capabilities of SRP and is more configurable. It is a set of group policy settings which are present in Windows 7, 8 and 10, but only in the higher end versions. I believe the Pro version, Ultimate, Enterprise and Education versions have AppLocker, but the Home editions do not, unfortunately. As with software restriction policies, you can get to it by gpedit.msc, which will bring up this local group policy editor if you're doing it on a non-domain machine. And you need to navigate through. Here we are: computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, application control policies, and then AppLocker. And here we are. So let's open this up. Let me just show you something here. So if I right click here, create new rule, just click next and next. Don't worry about what I've just gone through. I'll go through that in a second. What we've got here is what it calls the primary condition that you would like to create in order to do the whitelisting or the controlling of the applications. AppLocker rules specify which apps are allowed to run on your device. It allows multiple levels of enforcement as well as several methods of recognizing a whitelisted executable. Like, for example, it has the publisher here, which is essentially the signature. So as it says here, select this option if the application you want to create the rule for is signed by the software publisher. So public key cryptography. Then we have files and folders, essentially the path. So create a rule for a specific file or folder path. If you select a folder, all files in the folder will be affected by the rule. And then we have file hashes, which will be a hash run over the file so that you have a unique signature for that file. And as this says here, select this option if you want to create a rule for an application that is not signed. So all of these can be used to identify what it is you're trying to whitelist. You can create rules for what executable files are allowed and denied. So let's just close that. So you can see here you can create rules for what executable files are allowed and denied, Windows install rules, script rules, and packaged app rules. To switch AppLocker on, if you go here and you need to look for the configure rule enforcement, and then you can see these options here. So for each of those rule types that I just showed you, you can decide to switch it on. Enforce rules, and you'll see here there is an audit only option. Now you can use auditing to track which applications are being used and then automatically generate rules based on the applications that you've got. So that's a pretty cool option there, makes it much easier to set things up. So essentially you tick the ones that you plan to have rules for and enable them. I'm not going to enable these quite yet because you do have to be careful when you're doing this because you can lock yourself out of the system. So there we go, we would enable that there. So let's imagine we have enabled that. We can see the rules here which we would create. So let's imagine we want to stop someone on this machine from running Visual Studio as an example. So let's create a rule for that. So create new rule. We can skip this screen now, and then we would want a deny. We would select the person, or obviously we could select a group. So let's just stop everybody from using it. And then we can choose publisher, path, or hash. In this case, I'm going to choose the path and prevent them from using anything in the Visual Studio folder. And there we are, the Visual Studio folder. Click OK. Next. This is asking us if there's any exceptions, so if there's something within that folder that we would want to allow. So no. And then we can add a description there and then create. Okay. What it's asking us here now is, do we want to create default rules? And we're going to do that so I can show you what they are. So you may or may not want the default rules, but I'll show you what they are. So let's click yes. And here we can see it has created the default rules, which are these, and it's created the deny everyone to Visual Studio. Now the default rules are that everyone can run files in the program files folder and also the Windows folder. So it's essentially enabling everything that's installed. It's making the assumption that you want everybody to access everything that is installed, and here it's also allowing the administrators to access all files. So that's the default rules. You can of course delete the rules quite simply, or any rule that you want, just by clicking delete, or edit the rules simply by going through here. You would want to whitelist the applications or publishers or paths essentially that you trust and deny everything else. That's the basic principle. We do want to check that the service is actually running, because if the service is not running and starting, then you're not going to get very far here. So if we go to services, and you can see there we've got application identity, double click on this. This is essentially the service for AppLocker. We need that changed to automatic so that this comes on automatically. Otherwise it'll start and AppLocker won't work, so it'll be pretty pointless. So we want to enable that. So let's just delete these and I'll show you another thing that you can do. Another way of using this, you can build your machine, have everything on it that you're happy with, all the applications that you're happy with being run, and then you can create an automatic rule set. So if we right click here, we've got the automatically generate rules. Then it's going to ask for the path. In this case, we're looking at the program files because we're looking at executable rules. Obviously we can select groups here and individuals. This will give you an idea. And file hash is selected, and also digitally signed file. So as preference, it'll look for the digital signature because that is more reliable, and then it will look for the hash. And then click next. And then this will take a little bit of time while it generates the rules. And we can see there we've got 23 publisher rules, some file hash rules. You can view the files that were analyzed. You can select and deselect them. And then create. And then it's going to ask you about the default rules again. So let's click yes. And there you go. Pretty cool, isn't it? So it creates all of those for you. So as long as you've got an environment that you know is pretty static, this can work quite well. But as I said before, be very careful though that you don't lock yourself out. The Microsoft guide is quite good, which you can see here. Check that one out. Another couple of useful guides is this one here from SANS. And also NIST have produced this guide to application whitelisting, which is worth reading as well. We've talked through SRP and now AppLocker. There is an article there on combining the two together and a comparison here of their features. So let's talk about AppLocker vulnerabilities. What you can see here is Casey Smith using reg srv32 function to bypass AppLocker. As I have mentioned, whitelisting isn't perfect. Vulnerabilities have been found, but hopefully when they are found, they are fixed quickly. When you listen to this lecture now, this vulnerability may or may not be fixed. Who knows? But there you could see Casey bypassing AppLocker with reg serv32 function. And there's an article on it there on how that was done. And of course, other vulnerabilities will come and go. There's a good video here on general application whitelisting vulnerabilities and exploiting application whitelisting if you're interested. AppLocker on Windows is another recommended layer of protection for application control for whitelisting, but of course it's not perfect, as I've just demonstrated. If malware or an attacker can gain admin privileges, they can disable it, but a useful layer of protection. As I've mentioned, AppLocker is only included on the higher end editions of Windows, which is disappointing, but you can still restrict which apps are executable if you use something called the Family Safety Enhancement feature. It's a bit like AppLocker, but for all editions of Windows, and you can even get it on Windows 7 with a little tweak here and there, which it has an easier interface to AppLocker, but is also less functional. It is perfectly good enough for a home user if you want to do some form of whitelisting. All applications, including new.exe files that you download, can be blocked until they're specifically allowed, helping you block malware and other potential attackers. The simple idea of it is that you create a standard user as you would normally have, what you use for everyday use, which you would then apply the restrictions to. That standard user acts like as if it's a child. And because it's a child, you can restrict, as you can see here, what applications they can access. And you would then use that user day to day and have a separate admin user for admin tasks, as would be normal. And you can obviously use it for real children as well if you have them. It does, however, require online accounts that are synced with Microsoft, so that is a disadvantage. It is recommended by me if you prefer a quicker, easier interface and don't have access to AppLocker, but obviously if you're concerned about having an online account and that connection to Microsoft, then it's not a good choice. Parental controls are also offered by lots of vendors: Bitdefender, BullGuard, eScan, F-Secure, Kaspersky Labs. In fact, they have two solutions: McAfee, NetNanny, and so on and so on. You can see some of them here. These have actually been tested by AV-Test. So if you're interested in parental controls or using parental controls as a method of application control, check out AV-Test for their latest results and what they've got to say on the latest parental control tools. If you're interested in features specifically for children, then again, check out AV-Test because they have reviews. Obviously, any malware that gains admin privileges can disable parental controls, bypassing its protection completely. There are a number of third-party vendors for Windows which provide application execution control and whitelisting. I'll go through some of the players here. So first we have Kaspersky. Already gone through some of the features of Kaspersky in the AV section. Kaspersky has the trusted application mode, which ties into their reputation system. Once enabled, it has a deny all policy, but for the whitelisted applications. The Kaspersky system is flexible for those who don't have a static environment because the whitelist is dynamically based. This means you can choose to trust all signed apps, as an example, or not. You can choose to trust all apps in the Kaspersky Security Network reputation system or not, or you can manually choose what to trust. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility to be dynamic there. But of course, it means you're open to a little bit more risk because you've got a bigger attack surface because you're trusting the network reputation system, or you're trusting that a signed app is good. And that certainly isn't always true, but generally signed apps are good. But we know that hackers have stolen private keys in order to be able to generate signed apps. So there's an example, gives you a little bit of flexibility over simple whitelisting. That's Kaspersky's trusted application mode. It is pretty good. So that's an example of an AV product that has whitelisting. There are other AV products that have application controls, but I'm not familiar with every single one of them, of course. Bitdefender, as an example, has a limited white and blacklisting functionality, as do others. So application and execution control whitelisting can be gotten from antivirus, so check those out for options around application controls. Next is AppGuard, which is worth checking out. It's another advanced customizable application and execution control tool with whitelisting functionality, and you can get the personal edition here. There's also business and enterprise versions which have slightly different functionality. Check out the differences. It costs around $40 or something like that. If you do a search, you can find a free trial, but the trial that I found was an older version, so it's not that friendly when it comes to trialing. The interface looks like this, which is pretty simple. You've essentially got the protected mode, the allow installs, and off. So in protected mode, it only allows certain applications to run without restriction. And this is based on policy that you can customize if you click on the customize button. When you're in this protected mode, you might find that some programs don't work. For example, GoToMeeting didn't work, and what you need to do is then you need to move it down onto allow installs, run the application, and then put it back onto protected mode. Or you need to customize to allow access to the relevant areas of the file system if potentially that's what's wrong. When you want to install apps, then you use this mode here. When you click customize, you got these various options here. Now it has a whole bunch of different methods of protection. I'm not going to go into all of them, just going to go briefly over them. It's got 0-day protection, or what it calls unknown malware defense. It has an application container, what it calls guarded execution, which attempts to assure that protected applications are prevented from performing high-risk activities that might be exploited by malware. It has a memory guard, which prevents protected programs from writing to or reading from other processors' memory. It's got the install guard, which prevents the installation of programs from untrusted vendors. You've got the privacy mode, which prevents things like the browsers from reading what are private folders. You can designate what is user space, what is not user space. You've got pre-execution control and runtime protections, and you've also got protection against fileless types of malware that I've mentioned before, which uses things like built-in Windows tools. These are also blocked by AppGuard. I have seen workarounds to AppGuard to get around it and basically infect a system, and then I have seen AppGuard patch in order to prevent that from happening. If you want to know more about this, check out this manual here. Some others worth looking at for Windows. You've got this No Virus Thanks EXE Radar Pro, quite a name, but this is also another application and execution control tool which has blacklisting, whitelisting, and so on, which is available here at this URL. No Virus Thanks is available for around $25. Another tool is Voodoo Shield. It has a reasonably friendly interface, and there is a free version. It's free for non-commercial use, but the free version isn't very configurable. It's a little bit limited, as you can see, so things are grayed out. And then there's the Pro version, which is around $20 or so, and that can be downloaded from this website here. Moving towards the more business end of endpoint protection, stroke application control, whitelisting. Black Carbon has a product. Also McAfee has its application control product. And also Lumention has a application control product as well, which is offering a free trial. But those last three are more on the business side and are business priced. There are also challenges to the endpoint protection space, which have execution and application control features, or rather new methods of protection. And I'm going to be covering those challenges to the market in another lecture. Another recommended tool, this is an exploitation prevention tool. This can be downloaded for free from Microsoft. This is the main site here. You can see the URL. This is EMIT. This is the Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit. You can download it from here. There's a user guide here. User guide is definitely recommended for reading. EMIT blocks the exploitation techniques that are commonly used to exploit memory corruption vulnerabilities. There is actually a common set of exploitation techniques used to corrupt the memory. For example, a buffer overflow technique, you may have heard of that, quite commonly used, or a structured exception handler, SEH, override exploitation technique. These are used in many exploits. EMIT implements controls that attempt to make it harder to corrupt the memory using these common memory exploitation techniques. So even if an application is vulnerable, say it has a 0-day vulnerability, EMIT will attempt to make the execution of the exploit harder to do. So for example, if your 0-day exploit is using a particular technique to exploit that vulnerability, it may be blocked because it cannot get access to parts of memory that it needs to get access to. And that would be with various techniques. So you can see here, you've got this data execution prevention, or DEP. This has been around for quite a long time. Basically, memory segments may be marked as non-executable so that they cannot be misused by malicious software. And another one here, you've got this structured exception handler overwrite protection, long name, or SEHOP or CHOP. Now this one's quite important because this guards against what is currently the most common technique used for exploiting stack overflows in Windows. Then another one that's been around for a long time, address space layout randomization. So the addresses used by components of a process are randomized by this so that it's harder for an attacker to exploit specific memory vulnerabilities. Plus there are many other techniques that are used to try to prevent common exploitation techniques. So if I click on apps here, we can see some of them. Cancel that. Now if we see here, we've got the Internet Explorer exe, and these are all of the other techniques that it uses. If we double click on here, we can see all of the techniques that are used to attempt to prevent exploitations. And if you click on here, you can read more about them. And if you download the manual, this is a really good read for understanding the difference between all of these different exploitation mitigation techniques. And of course, as is usual, these techniques of defense are trying to be constantly subverted by attackers. And here's just one example of a paper on how to attempt to bypass ASLR and DEP. And DEP is a feature not just in Windows, but also in Linux and Mac OS or macOS. So back to Emmet here. If we click on Apps, Windows enables these protection mechanisms by default for its own system programs. Third-party application developers can also choose to enable them for their own applications, but because many of these developers don't do that, we can use Emmet to force these third-party applications to use these security mechanisms, which is great because it means these applications will have extra security protection. However, these features are not enabled by default for every program that you install, and that's because many will simply just stop working. So you have to see how they respond. If they work okay, then you can enable the features. If they don't work okay, then you may need to disable some of the features. Now, you will need .NET to install this, and these are the supported operating systems. And as you can see, Vista up to Windows 10 is supported currently. So after you've downloaded it and installed, let's just close that. What you can do is import the popular software, and then it will add more to your list of apps. Now, this list here that I showed you previously and just now, this is the long list. The recommended list is just quite a short list. So this adds common applications that have been tested, and it adds the various exploit prevention techniques for those particular applications. You can, of course, add protection to an application yourself just by clicking on Add, and then you scroll through, find an application, and then you can add it that way. Another way of doing it would be to look through your list here and then find some sort of process that you want to protect. Let's go with this one. Right click, configure process, and then there you go. You can just enable all of that protection. Now, a nice little trick to check to see if Emmet is actually enabled for the application. What you can use is Process Explorer, which you can see here. You can get that from Microsoft. Just do a search for Process Explorer and find what you're hoping is enabled. Right click, Properties, and then you'll see here Emmet settings, and you'll be able to see the various different protection that it's got. You can see here this has got SE hop, null page, heap spray protection. So cool. We know that that's actually working. Emmet utilizes shimming technology, so you can see if it's running on a process here if you show the lower panel and the DLLs. We also get indicators here as well. If we click on here, Trust, we can use certificate pinning. Click on the rules here, we click on there. What certificate pinning is, it means that Internet Explorer and Edge, the Microsoft browsers, will only use specific certificates for SSL and HTTPS when they go to these sites. This helps prevent dodgy certificates being produced by rogue or hacked certificate authorities, which are then used to masquerade as these sites, because obviously certificates are used as authentication to then start the encryption. So pinning helps you be more sure that you are visiting the real and genuine site before you do the encryption. Now, if you see here, you'll see the fingerprints. Those are the fingerprints of the certificates. So only certificates with those fingerprints will be allowed. When I do the security architecture for mobile banking apps, you always, and I always, make sure that pinning is enabled in the app so that the bank can only be authorized to the app with one set of certificates or fingerprints for transport encryption. This helps mitigate the SSL stripping attack. If we close that, and we can see we've got some profile options here. Currently we are on custom settings. You've also got the recommended settings, which is basically default, and then you've got maximum settings. So this will enable DEP for all applications and enabled SE hop for applications that don't specifically opt out of it. Now, maximum security isn't enabled by default because it can cause some applications not to work properly. If an application breaks, they need to go back into Emmet, disable certain security mechanisms for it, and check if the application is working properly. And that would just be done here by disabling the various features. But also try to remember when you have enabled Emmet for an application, because it's easy to forget, as some features of an application might start working some time after you have enabled Emmet. And Emmet doesn't provide any pop-up notifications to give you a hand in reminding you about Emmet. So Emmet is something else you need to think about if you've enabled it for an app, if the app isn't quite working correctly. So don't forget about Emmet. It does work pretty well, and on that imported list, all of those applications should work. They should work nice with this added layer of protection. If you change a system-wide setting and an application no longer works properly, change the system setting back or add a special exception for that application. Do be careful with these site-wide settings as they can cause system-wide issues. Because malware writers know about Emmet, they write to try to work around it. As I've said, any malware that gains admin rights can disable Emmet, unfortunately. But obviously, Emmet is there to attempt to stop them from getting admin rights. But Emmet has serious limits. It is not an integrated part of the operating system. Many of Emmet's features are not developed as robust security solutions. As such, while they block old techniques that exploits used in the past, and still a little bit now, they are not designed to offer real, durable protection against exploits over time. It is possible to find well-publicized and often trivial bypasses readily available online to circumvent Emmet, and here is one such report on the Angler exploit kit with code and functionality enabling it to bypass Emmet. Emmet should be used with all applications that interact with the internet or run files that have been downloaded from the internet, or basically any application that you know is a potential risk, i.e. it interacts in some way with something that is not trusted. This will protect you from malware and zero-day vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, many of the applications that interact with the internet that we do need to lock down with Emmet are already in the recommended software XML. So that's great, and as default should work without issues. Moving beyond Emmet and the future of Emmet, well, customer feedback on Emmet has been consistently requested that Emmet protections be directly implemented into the operating system. But to do that, Microsoft first had to change how they shipped Windows so that customers wouldn't have to wait years for new protections to become available. Now, Windows 10 is Windows as a service, if you like, and will be continually updated, so Emmet-type functionality and more is built into Windows 10. So support for Emmet will finish in July 2018 because Microsoft wants everyone to move to Windows 10 by 2018. Windows 10 integrates all of the mitigation features that Emmet provides, such as DEP, ASLR, and Control Flow Guard, CFG, along with other new mitigations to prevent bypasses in UAF and exploits targeting the browser and so on. And we cover Windows 10 specific controls in another lecture shortly. If you want to find out more about Emmet, definitely check out the user guide. It's really good. And I recommend you read through the various techniques that prevent these memory exploitation techniques so you can understand exactly and in detail how they work. There are 3 commercial products that I'm aware of that share a lot of functionality with Emmet, but also offer extended functionality for preventing exploitation techniques. If you want to go more advanced and comprehensive than Emmet, then it's worth looking at these as well. And these 3 are MBAE, which is the Malwarebytes Anti-Exploit. There's also Traps, that's Palo Alto's Traps. and Hitman Pro Alert. So let's start with the Malwarebytes anti-exploit offering. So this is the MBAE app, if you like. So this comes in a free and paid for version. The paid version is around $25. The free version stops exploits in the browser, stops Java, whilst the paid product adds protection for a wide range of software applications. Definitely worth checking out the free trial though. And then we have Palo Alto's Traps. I haven't tried this, but I did see a conference about it and spoke to one of the architects, but it is aimed at business users, so will be priced prohibitively, I would guess, for home users. From what I saw and from what I heard from the architect, it sounded good. Check out this video here for further exploitation and understanding of how exploitation prevention works. It's quite a good little video, it's only 15 minutes long. And then there is what I believe is probably the best out of what we've seen so far, and that is Hitman Pro Alert. This also comes bundled free with their antivirus second opinion product and the antivirus removal Hitman Pro, so is a good choice at just around €20, around $30 or so. Now if we go back here to this PDF, we can see a comparative breakdown between the four that I've just shown you. Now admittedly this is produced by the guys behind Alert, so clearly it can be biased, but if you go through this and read it and then read the documentation for the competitors and try them out, I've not been able to try out Traps though, Hitman Pro Alert does seem to have more features and more prevention methods. And we can see here the prevention methods here. I read a report on Alerts' real-world exploit effectiveness, and it was a positive report. Tried it out myself, also found quite positive results as well. In the report, it highlighted that one of the key differentiators is the hardware-assisted control flow integrity, which is the CFI check using the Intel's MSR registers. Other key differentiators of this Alerts compared to Emmet, as an example, are the filtering of import address tables, IAT, also application lockdown and automatic protection of alternative browsers like Chrome and Firefox, and all of their child processors, which you don't get in Emmet. Currently, certainly in Emmet 5.5 anyway, to protect Flash on Firefox, it's impossible due to the different file names of Flash for every version. Also, Emmet pretty much always fails to notify the user that it has blocked an attack. The browser just crashes in my experience. With Hitman Pro, on the other hand, you get notified, the user gets notified about the attack in most cases. Think of Hitman Pro as more of a anti-ransomware plus anti-exploit with Intel hardware assistance plus safe browsing. You can also download their exploitation test tool to test all the various exploitation techniques. This is a good exercise to teach you more about the methods and the tests. So check that out if this sort of thing is interesting to you. And obviously this is the download page for downloading it. And there is also a manual for the exploit tool as well. So those are the anti-exploit tools that are out there, certainly the ones I'm aware of for Windows: Emmet, MBAE, Traps, and Alerts. If you've got Windows systems, definitely worth checking these out. A new security innovation for Windows 10 that you need to be aware of is DeviceGuard. This is virtualization-based security. It is aimed at business users and is available only in Windows 10 Enterprise and Windows 10 Education. But for anyone technical and interested in strong security for Windows 10, then DeviceGuard should be used, as it is the next generation in operating system security for Microsoft. So let me break down how it works. To help protect against malware, hackers and zero-day vulnerabilities, threats, etc. When an app is executed or a process is run, Windows makes a determination on whether that app, that process, is trustworthy and notifies the user if it is not. To do this, it utilizes both hardware and software to lock down the device. And in order to do this, it has a few steps. So first, applications must have a valid digital signature to execute. This can be from a specific software vendor, from Microsoft, or the Windows Store. So this is the first little hurdle of protection as part of DeviceGuard. Unfortunately, just because something is digitally signed or from the Windows Store doesn't mean it is free of malware. A digital signature only verifies that the developer's private key signed it. The developer could be a bad guy, or a bad guy could have changed the code without the developer knowing when he got hold of the private key, or as has been seen in the wild, like in the example of Xcode, hackers had made changes to Xcode, the development environment, so the development environment was adding malicious code to an application, and then the application was signed. So digital signatures not perfect. The store could be compromised as well. Both Apple and Google have had rogue apps in their stores. But most current malware and attack tools are not currently signed, so this is a genuine hurdle to have to overcome. But of course, DeviceGuard takes it much further than just digital signatures because it adds extra options. You can sign whichever software you choose that you know and trust. You can have a list of your own signed trusted apps without needing to make any changes to the code. So you can be the master of what you trust. Microsoft calls this configurable code integrity. Any alterations to these applications would be noticed by DeviceGuard and wouldn't allow them to run. This is a nice little feature, this configurable code integrity. I like it. But what makes DeviceGuard really special is that it uses hardware technology and virtualization to isolate decision-making functions from the rest of the operating system. This helps provide protection from attackers and malware that have managed to even gain admin privileges. And they refer to this as virtualization-based security, or VBS. And this makes up a large part of what the DeviceGuard security offering is really. The Type 1 hypervisor technology that is used to run virtual machines in Microsoft, Hyper-V, is used to isolate core Windows services into a virtualization-based protected container. These hardware-protected containers are guarded by the IOMMU and other mechanisms in the CPU. The IOMMU attempts to block malware from accessing the lowest levels of the operating system. It controls what hardware can access the system memory, and it tries to prevent malicious drivers and devices from attacking the OS and apps. DeviceGuard isolates Windows services that verify whether drivers and kernel-level code are legitimate in a virtual container. Even if malware infects the machine, it cannot in theory access that container to bypass the checks and execute a malicious payload. This hypervisor container, or approach, or VBS as they call it, is using the security principle of isolation and compartmentalization, which is so important, and I have tried to convince you of its merits throughout this course. Microsoft seems to be on board with this idea now too. VPS, virtualization-based security, and technology like it, for me, is the next developmental stage for operating system security. DeviceGuard, using Windows 10, shares this isolation and compartmentalization principled approach with the Qubes operating system as an example, which is specifically designed as a security operating system or secure operating system, which of course we discussed at length early on in the course. DeviceGuard is more than a whitelisting mechanism because it handles whitelisting through virtualization, making it more effective. This means that malware and hackers with admin rights cannot then, in theory, alter the policy checks like you can with current whitelisting or exploit prevention tools like Emmet. Once you have admin rights with those, you can start fiddling with them. DeviceGuard has that advantage over signature, behavioral, and heuristic-based antivirus and application control technologies like AppLocker and others, which are subject to tampering by an administrator or malware or an attacker who has administrative access or system-level access. DeviceGuard will be used in combination with signature and behavioral and heuristic-based antivirus and endpoint protection and application control technologies to help block executable and script-based malware, while AV will continue to cover areas that DeviceGuard just doesn't cover, such as just-in-time based apps like Java and macros within documents. Using hardware-based virtualization to extend whitelisting is, I believe, the right move for operating systems. This isolation removes the vulnerability of services from both the user and kernel mode and acts as a barrier from current malware and threats. It will be interesting to see how DeviceGuard will be attacked and bypassed in the future. Currently, it seems solid by today's standards in terms of its theory, but it is only in theory a formidable defense against current malware and zero-day exploits. Hardware requirements. The hardware requirements for DeviceGuard are restrictive. To enable DeviceGuard, your device will need the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, UEFI firmware, Secure Boot, the Trusted Platform module, the TPM chip, and support for 64-bit virtualization. To use the hypervisor-based protections, which you really want to do, you'll need a processor with virtualization extensions. That means Intel VTX and AMD V and SLAT, SLAT, which is the second-level address translation support. Ideally, a processor that has IOMMU, such as Intel VTD and AMD IOV. So only enterprise or business hardware, not consumer laptops, currently support this type of hardware. Microsoft says the following computer makers that you can see here have already signed on to support DeviceGuard: Acer, Fujitsu, HP, Lenovo, etc. But lighter laptops are unlikely to support these sort of hardware requirements, certainly in the short term, but maybe in the long term. If you want to find out whether the devices that you have can support DeviceGuard, then download this here, DeviceGuard and Credential Guard Hardware Readiness Tool, which is a PowerShell script which you just run and it'll let you know what features you can support. DeviceGuard goes beyond the old AppLocker feature, which could be accessed by attackers with administrative privileges, as I've already said. Only an updated policy signed by a trusted signer can change the DeviceGuard app control policy that has been set on the device. Although AppLocker is not considered a new DeviceGuard feature, it complements DeviceGuard functionality when enforced code integrity cannot be fully implemented or its functionality does not cover every desired scenario. There are many scenarios in which code integrity policies would be used alongside AppLocker rules. As a best practice, you should enforce code integrity policies at the most restrictive level possible, and then you can use AppLocker to fine-tune the restrictions to an even lower level. One example in which DeviceGuard functionality needs AppLocker supplementation is when you would like to limit universal applications. Universal applications have already been validated by Microsoft to be trustworthy to run, but you may not want those applications to be capable of running. You can accomplish this enforcement by also using an AppLocker rule. If you're not concerned about the serious privacy issues you get from using Windows 10, then DeviceGuard is a real security advantage and highly recommended. If you are concerned about privacy, Windows 10 is unfortunately out, which is a shame given this great feature. But we still don't know how secure Windows 10 really is. We know it has good security features, but that does not mean it doesn't have a lot of security vulnerabilities. We only see that through time. And through time, we can evaluate how secure the operating system has been. But it certainly has strong features that will help mitigate security threats. If you wanted to know how to configure and deploy Device Guard, then check out this deployment guide here. It is configured through servers and through group policies and such like. It is not really very deployable on a home network, especially as you're unlikely to have hardware that even supports it. If you're interested in the future of Microsoft's security strategy for Windows, or rather Windows 10, as that's the future, then there was a Black Hat talk, and these are the slides from that talk, so that's worth checking out. So that's Windows 10 Device Guard. Something else to definitely be aware of that I've just become aware of myself as of recording, Microsoft have announced the Windows Defender Application Guard for the Edge browser, which is a type of sandbox stroke isolation technology for that browser. This is an announcement on it here. And here is Microsoft's glossy video on what it is. I'll give this a quick play.
The internet has completely changed the way we work and do business. It's hard to imagine a world without it. Today, attacks frequently target the browser, any browser, as a way to breach organizations and access their data, so it's critical that we make it a safe place. With Windows Defender Application Guard, we want to make your experiences just that, safe and secure. We're excited to show you this in Microsoft Edge. Websites that are considered untrustworthy by your business or enterprise will automatically launch Microsoft Edge in an isolated session. These sessions are visually different to ensure users understand they're in a more secure browsing environment. Enterprise administrators have full control to decide which sites the organization trusts and which launch protected with Application Guard. Our patented hardware virtualization technology extends beyond the kernel level, protecting your network from malware, viruses, vulnerabilities, and even zero-day attacks. This lightweight virtual machine isolates malicious activity coming from the web, preventing it from reaching the underlying operating system, apps, and data. If the user encounters malicious content, it's contained within Application Guard. The user can close this session without impacting their PC or network. So as your employees browse the web, Application Guard and Microsoft Edge keep your business network safe and secure.
So there you go, definitely interesting and something to watch. It sounds like they are implementing the security techniques direct into the Edge browser that I recommend in the browser security section of this course, but all built into the Edge browser, which is very nice. Windows 10 is looking very promising from a security point of view, such a shame about the privacy issues. Linux by default on most distributions has a standard account and a super user account. So the standard account here is Nathan and the super user account is the root account. So there we go. I'm just SUing to root now. So that's the super user. The standard user is used during all tasks, apart from special tasks that require system and or root privileges. The whole operating system architecture within Linux allows for a non-root user to perform most everyday tasks without needing root privileges. This provides Linux with its first layer of application control. Anyone who uses Linux will be aware of the su and sudo commands, and you'll be aware if you've watched any of this course. The su command there that I've just done, suing to root, that is the substitute user command, which, as you just saw, allows users to switch the terminal to a different account by entering the username and password of that account. If no username is given, then root is used, thus providing a fast method to obtain a shell login with full privileges to the system, and you can issue an exit command to return the user to their normal account. So just exit like that, and now I'm back with my standard Nathan user. And we've got sudo here. Sudo is a configurable command line tool similar to su, but it allows certain users to run programs with root privileges without spawning a root shell. So for example, sudo ping, and then I have to enter the password for root, and it allows me to run ping. Let's talk about access control models now. For every access attempt before a subject, and we'll call them a subject, this is actually a security term, before a subject can communicate with an object, again, an object is a security term in security theory, the security kernel reviews the rules of the access control model to determine whether the request is allowed. So we've got subject and object. Security kernel determines by reviewing the access control model if the request is allowed. Within Linux, we can alter the access control model using a security framework or Linux kernel security module. Most home operating systems use an access control model that is known as a discretionary model. So that's a DAC, discretionary access control model, where the owners decide who has access to resources. The access control lists are used to enforce these access decisions. It is at the discretion of the owner. So that's how you can remember it. It's at the discretion of the owner, a discretionary DAC model. It's an informal approach that should be set up on the basis of a need to know, the need to know principle within security and least privilege. And the discretionary model is identity based. For example, Nathan can read, write, and execute this file. He can not read this file. He can write this file and execute this file, and so on. And that would be decided at the discretion of the owner. The way permissions are often set up by a home user on Windows, that's discretionary. It's at their discretion that the subject, the person in this case, can access the file, the object in this case. Now, if you go to work, university, school, etc., you may encounter a non-discretionary model, meaning that access decisions are not made at the discretion of the owner of the data. So, for example, you may own some data technically at work or actually at work, depending on policy, or at school, but access controls are put in place by an authoritative entity. And that's usually some sort of systems administrator, but he is applying those access controls based on rules that he has been given down by some other authority potentially. But that's a non-discretionary model. And this type of model, this non-discretionary model, is often used in combination with something called role-based access control, or RBAC, where, as the name suggests, access decisions are made on each user's role and or functional position. For example, people in an accounts department will be put in an accounts group, which then gives them access to certain things, like they may be able to then access the payroll information automatically. They don't need to be specifically given permission to certain files based on who they are, but they automatically get access because they're part of a group. That is role-based access control. Now, a more restrictive access control model, and that is the mandatory access control model, which is the MAC model. Not to be confused with the MAC address or the MAC laptop, the mandatory access control, or in fact the MAC within the ISO layer. There's quite a few MACs. This is the mandatory access control. So this is where the operating system enforces the system security policy through the use of security labels. So subject and object must have an associated label with attributes at all times. It's much more restrictive, this MAC model, as I've said. And security labels, so a security label might be unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret, etc. Categories might be a group, so a department, a project, or it could be a clearance level, so you're cleared for a certain type of area or certain type of project. MAC can also be used in combination with role-based access control. Now, the MAC model is commonly used in the military and in some tightly controlled government organizations, as you might be able to tell from those types and examples of labeling. Only people with a certain classification can get access to certain types of data. That would be based on a security label. An object like a file might have a security label which labels it as top secret. So unless you are marked as top secret, you will not be able to get access to it. But maybe even if you are marked as top secret, yet it has a category of, say, Project X, and you don't have access to Project X, even if you have top secret clearance, you can't access it. And this is the mandatory access control model. This is a common way in Linux to do application control, execution control, and prevent access to parts of the operating system. And SE Linux is the most common implementation of that, which we're going to talk about in a second. Linux security frameworks now. In order to implement stricter mandatory access control, the MAC model and other application controls and anti-exploit technology, we need a Linux security framework or Linux kernel security module, helping to protect against malware, 0 days, kernel and memory corruption, and kernel and driver bugs, and so on. And the three major options are GS Security, SE Linux, and AppArmor. And you can see here in front of you AppArmor. We'll talk about that one first. So AppArmor, short for Application Armor. It is a Linux kernel security module that allows the system administrator to restrict a program's capabilities with per program profiles. So for example, you can restrict Apache, the web browser Apache, from being able to access parts of the file system that Apache has no need to access. Essentially, you can create containment. AppArmor is arguably the best supported security framework in Debian, and for this reason, it is used in Tails. If you type AppArmor_status, you can find out if you have AppArmor installed or not. Many operating systems have AppArmor profiles for specific programs, making it easier to set up containment using AppArmor. If it is not installed, then search for how to install it on your particular distribution. If you have Debian, then check out this page here. This will tell you how to configure it. I would recommend having a look at this video as well, which is from the EFF, which is a quick breakdown on how to set up AppArmor on Linux. AppArmor is recommended as a security framework for isolation for application control because it is fairly lightweight and easy to set up versus the other options that we're going to go through. The next security framework now. This is Security Enhanced Linux, also known as SE Linux, or commonly known as SE Linux, which is a Linux kernel security module that provides a mechanism for supporting access control security policies, including the mandatory access control model, which we have already gone through. SE Linux is a set of kernel modifications and user space tools that have been added to various Linux distributions over the years. This is the most commonly known, most well-known implementation of the MAC model. Debian, for example, has packaged Linux kernels with SE Linux support compiled in, but disabled by default, as do many other distributions. With SE Linux, access can be constrained on, for example, which users and applications can access which resources. These resources may take the form of files, standard Linux access controls such as file modes like read, write, execute are modifiable by the user and the applications which the user runs. SE Linux access controls are determined by a policy loaded on the system which may not be changed by mistakes or misbehaving applications. SE Linux also adds a finer granularity to access controls. Instead of only being able to specify who can read, write, or execute a file, for example, SE Linux lets you specify who can unlink, append only, move a file, and so on. SE Linux allows you to specify access to many resources other than files as well, such as network resources and inter-process communication, IPC. So this is all great for security. This can really lock down a system. In a practical sense, though, enabling SE Linux, enabling Mac, severely limits what the system can do, which is both good for security, but bad for usability and for the system to be dynamic. But generally, an SE Linux or Mac environment is not supposed to be like that. You'll find that you'll need a very static environment that requires little change for this to not be a large administrative burden to install SE Linux. One approach to mitigate this security issue, or to provide layers of protection, is you can use some type of virtualization. So you can have your host operating system being SE Linux and that being pretty static, and then you use some sort of virtualization like VirtualBox or Docker or VMware, and the guest is then used for a more dynamic environment. But of course that's quite a specialist setup, but we'll give you quite a solid setup there. The process to enable SE Linux will obviously depend on the distribution that you have. Here is an example of setting up Linux on Debian. So check that out if SE Linux sounds of interest to you. Another security framework here, GR Security. And this describes itself as an extensive security enhancement to the Linux kernel that defends against a wide range of security threats through intelligent access control, memory corruption-based exploit prevention, and a host of other system hardening that generally require no configuration. Debian does not ship a GR Security kernel, sadly. GR Security is the superior option of the three that we have gone through, SE Linux and AppArmor in my opinion. It requires much more Linux Kung Fu skills for you to get it to work with a distribution that you may want to get it to work with, such as Debian. Here is a useful page here on how you might enable it, but the average user will definitely struggle to get it all working. If you would like to give it a try with Debian, then I would recommend this guide here, which is very good on enabling it on your desktop. In terms of a comparison with SE Linux and AppArmor, we can come here and have a look, and you can see all of the various functions that GR Security has versus the others, SE Linux and AppArmor. If we go down, you can see all of the various controls, some of which you will be familiar with now that we've gone through various different exploit and application control mechanisms, ASLR protection, for example. So you can see lots there. And if you're interested in more of a comparison in terms of administration and other things like that, this is also a useful link of a comparison if you're considering implementing a security framework. And for a proper lockdown Linux box, you would definitely want to use a Linux security framework, and probably one of these. But the reason that most people don't enable these is because simply they break things, and it's quite difficult to get these to work unless you really understand Linux. It's quite a long learning process. Now, there are Linux distributions that maintain a kernel package with GR Security or come with GR Security. Some that I am aware of but cannot endorse because I've not really had a good look at them. Pentoo is one. Alpha is another, which is a small, lightweight Linux distribution. As you can see, only 81 meg, and it's using BusyBox for the tools. So that would be a very good, lightweight, secure Linux, if that's what you were looking for. And Arch has Linux kernel modules for GR Security. Arch is another distribution that I recommend. And for Debian, here you've got some unofficial repositories compiled to make it a little bit easier to get it running on Debian. Something else to check out, currently it's in alpha, but maybe by the time you listen to this lecture it could be a little bit more advanced, is ColdKernel. ColdKernel is an automated build tool, as it says here, for GR security enabled kernels on Debian, Ubuntu and CentOS. So basically it's going to help you build hardened kernels. And if you look here, you can see the GitHub page for it as well. So there you go, ColdKernel, something to keep an eye on for GR security. So that's GR security. That is my recommended security framework for anyone who really knows what they're doing when it comes to Linux. Worth checking out. It's a vast improvement on the standard Linux kernel, which is definitely due a rethink now. This is PAX. You'll often see this where people are using GR security. PAX is a patch for the Linux kernel that implements least privilege protections for memory pages. The least privileged approach allows computer programs to do only what they have to do in order to be able to execute properly and nothing more. You would use both PAX and GR security together or another framework. And for completeness, you should be aware of some other security frameworks that are out there that are just a little less popular. Here we have RSBax, which is the rule set based access control. This can enable several security models like MAC, ACLs, RC, and it allows for full fine-grained control over objects like files, processors, users, devices, and so on, and also memory execution prevention. And this is Tomoyo Linux, similar to SE Linux. It's another Mac implementation of Linux. And this is FBAC LSM. You can enable several security models in this like MAC and DAC and generally restrict and lock things down. Another security framework. And finally here we have a security model that collects system-wide DAC security protections that are not handled by the core kernel itself. So there you go, various different security frameworks and modifications you can make to the core of Linux to prevent exploits and control application execution. Access control lists and user permissions can be used in both Linux and Mac for application control and execution prevention, and some general application strategies that you can choose to adopt are these. First is limit the processes that run as root. For example, you should never run a service like Apache or SSH as root or with root permissions. That's just asking for trouble, because when that or if that service gets compromised, then it has maximum permissions. It's the sort of thing that people used to do back in the day, actually not that long ago, and then when they got compromised, whoever compromised it had full control of the box. You want to limit the users that can start processes directly or indirectly. You want to limit process and user access to directories or folders and files on a need to have access basis. Try to limit file descriptors, memory and other system resources that can be quickly exhausted as well. So we've used sudo a number of times in the course. I've already mentioned it in this section. Sudo is a configurable command line tool similar to SU, but it allows certain users to run programs with root privileges without spawning a root shell. For example, sudo and then a command. Ping, for example. It can also do a lot more than that, and it can be used to lock down what users can do and also enable users to do things without having to give them the permissions of the root user or the password of the root user for all things. You can be more granular. Now it could be that you might not even have sudo installed, so you may need to install it with that command there. If you just type sudo, you can tell whether or not you've got it installed. There is a sudo as file that you edit in order to configure sudo. Now you can edit that via a regular text editor, but it's absolutely not recommended, because if you make a mistake or the file gets corrupted, then you could lock yourself out completely out of the system. So for that reason, there is a special way of editing the file, which is sudo by sudo. And then that takes you into In this case, this is nano, and you can edit this file, and this is what it looks like. And what you can see here, we've got the privileged user root. We can see we've got this all equals all ... all. What this shows is the rule that this applies to is root, and this first all indicates that this rule applies to all hosts, and then this all here indicates that the root user can run commands as all users. This all here indicates that the root user can run commands as all groups, and this all here indicates that these rules apply to all commands. So obviously, if you change these, it changes commands, groups, users, hosts, and the username. And you can see here, we actually don't have a username. What we've got here is a group. So this means that anybody in the group sudo has these permissions. And that's often how it works in Linux, that you get assigned to the sudo group, and then you're able to use a sudo command. You'll find in Mac and BSD that this may not be sudo, it could be wheel instead, the group wheel. So let's exit out of here. So if we have a look at the group file, we can see all of the groups in here, and we saw that there was a sudo group. So there we go. We can see the two members. We've got Nathan, we've got me, and we've got Bob. So Nathan and Bob, we can use sudo. And when we use sudo, we have full permissions over everything with the all. So let's exit out of here. Let's add a user. So to add a user, we can use user add, or we can use add user. Add user does more automatically for us. So we'll use the add user. You may or may not have it installed, then you just install it. So sudo add user, and then Blippi is our username. And we can see it's done a few things there. It's added them to a group, created a home directory, etc. Let's give them a password. And then it's going to ask a bunch of questions here that we could fill in if we were doing this for real. So now we've got a Blippi user. So we want Blippi to be able to sudo. So in order to do that, we can sudo usermod -a G sudo Blippi. And there we go. So let's check out the groups file. Scroll down here. And there we go. We can see Blippi is in there. So Blippi will be able to use sudo, obviously. Exit out of there. Go back to sudo via sudo. And this file here, you want to check out the man page so you can find the syntax. And essentially you can lock down what users you want to have access to what commands. And you can be quite granular with this if you want to use this as a tool for locking down the system. File permissions now. So ls-la. The A, by the way, is an option to show hidden or all files, and the L is an option to show a long listing. So we click here, we can see the file permissions for the various files and folders. So here we can see 5 files. They're actually VPN related files. If we look at the permissions here, we can see we've got read and write for the owner, we've got read for the group, and we've got read for everyone else. So let's imagine we want to change those permissions. So we want to change it so it's read write for the owner. So that would be a 6. And then we want no access to the group and no access to anybody else. So that would be 600. And then we need the name of the file. ca.crt is the one we're going to choose here. There we go. It's -la. And we can see the permissions have changed. So if we bring in this table here, you can see what numbers correspond to what permission. The first number we put in is the owner, the second number is the group, the third number is everyone. 4 is read permission, 6 is read write, 7 is read write execute, 0 is no permissions. You might want to change who owns the file. So that would be done with chown, then the user that you're changing it to, and then the name of the file. There we go, ls-la. We can see that that has changed to nobody. That's just a very quick intro to the permissions and how to change them and the access control list. So the obvious question is, what do we want to change it to? Well, we have a whole section on hardening the operating system. And when you get to that section, we talk about standards and guidelines that have been put together by industry experts. And those things are better to use than to come up with your own methods, or at least they're better to use as a basis. So when we get to the section on hardening, the standards have permissions in there, file permissions, and you want to check those out for what you want to lock down. MacOS features the Parents Control tool, which can be used for whitelisting if you set up an account for day-to-day use and then set that up as if it is a child. Then you can lock down what it can do. So if you go into System Preferences, then you'll see Users and Groups. Let's unlock this. And then you need to add a user or modify the user that you do use on a day-to-day basis. But obviously, make sure you do have another user that is an admin user. You will need an admin user, and you will need the user that you're going to lock down and use for day-to-day use. And then you would enable parental controls. Open parental controls, and you're presented with this screen here. You can also get to parental controls directly from there. And we can see we've got apps, web, stores, time, privacy, other. And you can see we've got a few things here. These are all pretty self-explanatory. Allow use of the camera, allow joining Game Center multiplayer games. So you can, disable whichever it is you want to disable. But the main whitelisting functionality is here. And already what I've done is I've disallowed access to lots of different things. And what this means is that any malware or attacker that has the permissions of the John user, which is what he will have if he's compromised the system generally through your account, then he will need to escalate his permissions in some way, but often by using some sort of vulnerability. So we can see this guy's locked down and he's got access to calculator. You've got web also. You can allow unrestricted access to websites. You can try to limit access to adult websites, and you can allow access to only these websites. So you can whitelist and you can blacklist, as you can see here. Always allow these websites, never allow these websites. Not really whitelisting, but you can restrict access to stores here as well. You can alter the times. If you know that you're never going to be working on this at a certain time, you can enable it. Other privacy settings and access to things like printers, dictation. But mainly the main two would be the web and the apps. So now for day-to-day use, we would use the John account. We would have enabled all of the things that you would want to have access to. But then anything new that crops up, you won't be able to get access, such as malware. So we're logged in as John. So if we can launch Calc. So there we go, Calc as launched. But let's see if we can launch Firefox, which is blocked. And there we go, we can see that the application cannot be opened. So there you go, parental controls. That's a simple way of whitelisting within macOS. Gatekeeper is a built-in anti-malware feature of Mac OS X, macOS 10.7 and plus, designed to protect the operating system from unauthorized code, and was designed with a non-technical Mac user in mind. So generally, this is the idea of it. If a file is downloaded and then run, and that file was written by an unknown developer, unknown to Apple, or the file integrity has been changed based on its digital signature, Gatekeeper will pop up a warning. Warnings such as these, as I'm sure you'll be familiar with if you're a Mac user. So here it's saying that the file you're trying to run is from an unidentified developer. So the developer is not known to Apple. Here it's saying cannot be opened because it was not downloaded from the store. The file appears to be damaged. So how does Gatekeeper determine this? Well, if we go to System Preferences, and we go to Security and Privacy, General tab, and you can see here, allow apps downloaded from. Let's give ourselves access. And we can see we've got 3 options here of protection. Well, actually, there's 2 options of protection, really. So the first one, Mac App Store. So this means only apps that come from the Mac App Store can be opened. So that's the strictest of restrictions for Gatekeeper. Then the next one down, Mac App Store and identified developers, which is the default setting. So only allow apps that come from or are downloaded from the Mac App Store, plus developers who are using Gatekeeper will be allowed to run. And then the final one, Anywhere, allows applications to run regardless of their source on the internet. This was the default in Mac OS X Lion, but that has now changed. Gatekeeper is effectively turned off with this setting, but developer ID signed apps that have been inappropriately altered will not open, even with this option selected. So the best option would be obviously this top one, but unfortunately at the moment, most things are not in the Mac App Store. It's not like the iOS phone. We are moving in that direction for macOS, but we are not there at the moment. So this is really the only workable solution at the moment. You can of course put it on this one for day-to-day use and then change it onto this one when you get some sort of pop-up when you're trying to install something. Unfortunately, just because something is signed doesn't mean it's free of malware. If it is signed, this is only a verification that somebody with the developer's private key signed it, not that it is free of malware, and it's not even a full guarantee that the developer signed it. It is just a strong hope that they did. The developer also could be a bad guy, or bad guys could have changed the code without the developer knowing. Just because something is signed and from the store doesn't mean it is free of malware. In fact, apps have got onto the App Store, the Apple App Store, that were signed and did have malware. And you can see an example on this BBC News article here. Hackers had infected a pirated copy of the app development tool Xcode, and the developers were using this pirated version of Xcode. So the app developers were unaware that their development environment was compromised. And when they uploaded their apps to the store, you then had signed apps with malware on the App Store. There is a checking and verification process to get on the App Store, but it's not actually as strong as some people might think. But most malware isn't currently signed though, and the rigor of getting approval to get on the App Store is at least a reasonable defense that is worth having, although just not perfect. Because of the way Gatekeeper was designed, there are actually ways for malware to get around it. And if you want to know more detail, look at the technical detail of how Gatekeeper works and its weaknesses, then check out this presentation here by Patrick Wardrell, who is one of the leading researchers on Mac OS malware. This guy's got some very good tools and very good research. You want to know anything about Mac security, he's one of the guys you want to check out. And also here we have a Gatekeeper Exposed report, which is worth checking out if you want to know more on how to bypass it. A possible mitigation to the issues of Gatekeeper and the bypasses to Gatekeeper is to use this tool here, Ostierus, but it is for just El Capitan. What this does is it blocks unsigned internet binaries from executing when Gatekeeper doesn't. So there we go, that is Gatekeeper from Apple. It provides some protection, limited protection. Obviously, whenever there is a flaw found in technology, the developers attempt to fix those problems. Apple is actually very good when it comes to security, but in this case, Gatekeeper happens to have a relatively poor design. But it should be enabled, but like most things, as I've said, it's far from perfect. It won't protect against advanced persistent threats, custom malware, targeted malware, or any malware that has been designed to get around Gatekeeper. Mac OS X 10.11 and later versions of the Mac operating system now include something called the System Integrity Protection, or SIP. And with this, macOS is taking a small step further down the road towards becoming a full iOS-style lockdown operating system. System Integrity Protection aims to make Macs more resistant to malware and hackers by preventing the modification or removal of certain system files and locking more of the core system down. And it is enforced by the kernel. So before SIP came along, before the System Integrity Protection came along, so that is in 10.10 Yosemite and older, the root user had no permission restrictions. So root could access any system folder or app on the Mac if you were running as root or had root permissions, meaning any malware or hacker gaining root pre-system integrity protection has or had full access to the operating system. And to quote Apple, what this meant or what this means if you're on 10.10 or older, any piece of malware or hacker is one password or vulnerability away from taking full control of the device. So now, as of Mac OS X 10.11 and later, we now have System Integrity Protection, which restricts the root account and limits the actions that the root user can perform on protected parts of the Mac operating system. And Apple refers to this as rootless. So even if you are root, you are still restricted. So a summary of the system integrity protections comprises of the following mechanisms. So you've got protection of contents and file system permissions of system files and directories. You've also got protection of processes against code injection, runtime attachment like debugging and DC trace, and protection against unsigned kernel extensions. So system integrity protection protects system files and directories that are flagged for protection. This happens either by adding an extended file attribute to a file or directory, by adding the file or directory to a special file, and that special file is rootless.conf, and that's where you can find that file, or both of those things. And system integrity protection as default includes protection of these parts of the system: system, USR, bin, SBIN, and apps that are pre-installed with macOS. Paths and apps that third-party apps and installers can continue to write to include /applications, library, and so on. System integrity protection is designed to allow modification of these protected parts only by processes that are signed by Apple and have special entitlements written to system files such as Apple software updates and Apple installers. Most pre-installed Apple applications in /applications are protected as well. The kernel stops all processes without specific entitlements from modifying the permissions and contents of flagged files and directories, and also prevents code injection, runtime attachments, and dtrace, as I've said, with respect to protected executables. These symbolic links from here are also protected, which you can see. Apps that you download from the Mac Store already work with the system integrity protection. If you're a developer, you've already got your apps in the App Store, then they will continue to work. Other third-party software can conflict with system integrity protection, which is part of the reason so many people have had compatibility issues with El Capitan and the later versions. SIP also extends to lock down various Mac software like Finder and Dock and anything launched from protected folders. Example, Dropbox. The way this used to work is it would mess about with the Finder to show sync status for files and folders, but Apple added generic code to support that in Yosemite. File extensions that modify the core of the OS, the part that handles input and output and launching background software and so on, will still be allowed, but they will have to be cryptographically signed by a developer with a valid certificate from Apple. System integrity protection is enabled by default, but it can actually be disabled with this command here, and it can equally be enabled with this command here. SIP is an added layer of defense for Mac, and it's something that you would want to use. It would only switch off if you had some sort of serious problem with an application. But in time, the application should be updated anyway to work with SIP, because this is the way that Mac is going and that Apple is going. If you would like to know more technical detail on SIP, then check out this presentation here. Skip along until you get to the part by this guy here, Pierre-Olivier Martel. He's one of the guys at Apple behind this product. So check that presentation out for a more detailed look at this, and also more on Mac security. It's quite a good presentation. So that's the system integrity protection, new from El Capitan onwards. natively on Mac, other than parental controls, which we've already gone through, there is no really good way to keep arbitrary apps from launching, and especially when software launches separately, things like command line utilities and other scripts. There's no real way to provide good application control. There are two relatively new tools that can give you application control, black and white listing, and other features. Now, the first is something called Santa, and we're going to cover this one now, and we'll cover the second one in the next lecture. This is unofficially from Google. Google uses Macs. They have a lot of Macs in their estate, and they need to protect those Macs. So Google actually produced quite a lot of good tools for Mac, and this is one of them, Santa, which they've made free and open source, which is very nice of them. Why is it called Santa? Well, it's named Santa because it keeps track of binaries that are both naughty and nice. Very amusing. So Santa is a binary whitelister, blacklister system for macOS. It consists of a kernel extension that monitors for executions, a command line daemon that makes execution decisions based on the contents of a SQLite database. There's also a GUI agent that notifies the user in case there is a block decision. And this is the GUI here. If you were to click on the file, you would get the pop-up here telling you the application has been blocked from executing because its untrustworthiness cannot be determined. And there's also a command line utility for managing the system and synchronizing the database with a server. And it can be run in two modes. It has its monitor mode and it has lockdown mode. In monitor mode, as the name suggests, it records information about what apps launch, and it only blocks specific blacklisted programs in monitor mode. And the way this works is Santa uses signatures, or hashes essentially, of the programs to prevent them from running. And as we know, hashes can be changed quite easily, so it's not the strongest form of protection. And then we have the other mode, the lockdown mode. In lockdown mode, Santa only allows whitelisted programs to run, and system and root can also only run those whitelisted applications. In lockdown, the utility can be set to allow binaries or programs that are signed by an approved developer, which allows updated apps to run without requiring them to be separately whitelisted. You can also blacklist directories or folders to prevent software not installed in the applications or system folders from running. Google recommend that you run Santa in monitor mode for a while to see what programs are used, and then from that you can develop a whitelist before you put it into lockdown mode. As of recording, there's no tool that exists yet to convert the log into a whitelist. And also what would be useful would be an ability to synchronize with some sort of master list, both whitelist and blacklist. That would be useful too, and I'm sure that will potentially be coming. And like most things, they get vulnerabilities. One vulnerability that I have seen is here, but of course these things evolve and are fixed. Santa is a work in progress, certainly as of recording, but maybe by the time you hear this lecture, it could be in a more mature state. So definitely worth something to check out if you have a Mac and you want application control. The next application control tool that you can get for Mac is LittleFlocker, which you can get from www.littleflocker.com. LittleFlocker is a more extensive tool than Santa. It is a programmable macOS kernel extension that enforces file access and modification policies using macOS's kernel-level Mandatory Access Control Framework, or MACF, M-A-C-F. So it's an implementation of the Mandatory Access Control model that we've already discussed. It is actually the trusted BSD Mandatory Access Control Framework that they have adopted, that Apple has adopted, as macOS is based on BSD. MACF is used by Apple to hook a number of tasks related to system integrity, protection and sandboxing on macOS and also iOS. Mandatory Access Control Framework allows LittleFlocker to intercept every file operation on the system and analyze it against a set of policies that look like this, that are programmed into the kernel at boot time. If malware was able to run as root on a Mac, the kernel module continues to enforce the rules and cannot in theory be unloaded by any root privileged malware or hacker. And Little Flocker also has its own form of integrity protection to protect itself from being deleted, unloaded, or killed. And it comes in 3 core pieces. It has the kernel extension, which contains a live copy of all active rules, a helper daemon that programs the kernel module at boot time, and a user space client that presents prompts to the user, and a status bar to control Little Flocker. So let's take a look at it. After you've installed Flocker, it will start up and it will automatically go into learning mode, and you'll be prompted with a screen that looks like this, and just allow it to go through its learning process. And when it's done, the indicator will disappear. If Little Flocker detects any startup applications, all of the activity that Little Flocker has learned will be presented to you in the form of suggested rules. These are rules that Little Flocker has created based on what runs at system startup time. Any rules that are learned are just temporary rules. You can actually remove them at any time. So you want to review the rules and uncheck any that you don't want. And when you finish checking, then you want to import those rules. Little Flocker goes through a similar learning process if any process makes any unauthorized access attempt during boot up, and will prompt you with new rule suggestions after you finish booting. So then you'll have a set of rules that will look something like this. And up here, you'll have access to enable and disable it. You can switch it into simple mode and advanced mode. Simple mode essentially just shows you less information. We'll keep it in advanced mode at the moment. Then you've got your advanced options, and this one here is important. You can switch it into learning mode, and that's probably a good idea, and then use your system for a while, and it will start to generate rules that you can potentially use. And we've got Little Flocker configuration, which is this. Preferences. You may want to allow a non-admin user to create rules. And we can see the level of detail. I've got it here on full detail for here. And we've got another advanced monitoring option. Only monitor executions of signed apps. This does not affect file access prompts. Another option. So I'm going to remove a rule here. This is for Firefox. So I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to click on Firefox. And this is the sort of prompt that you'll get. This is in the advanced mode when you try to do something that's not in the rule set. So as you can see here, this is the path of the file name, application path, and it's been signed. You can see here it's signed by Mozilla. So what is it that we want to do with this? Fundamentally, do we want to deny it? Do we want to allow it? Do we want it to be read only, create only, mount, execute, etc.? And then we have once, which means you'll be prompted the next time the application needs access. You've got until quit. The application will be allowed access until it quits. You've got until reset. The application is allowed access until macOS is restarted. And forever, obviously, the rule will be added to the rules file and access will be permanent unless deleted. Let's add allow. We can see there what we've got as the rule. So let's edit that. And we can see read, write, create. If we go here, show system rules, you can see all the rules that were added as part of the learning process. Obviously, you can remove those. Now, of course, it's a little bit complicated as to what rules you should add and not add. So there is a feature here to import. And if we look here, we've got third-party applications. So maybe you're using Malwarebytes. Open. You can import the rules required for using Malwarebytes. Import. And there they are. Pretty good, eh? Import again. And we've got some other examples here. So let's look at goodies. Got one here. So you can block Spotlight and suggestions from collecting metadata. Here we can prevent applications from installing startup processes without authorization. Then here's a nice one. You can monitor and prompt on any built-in webcam usage. And we've got some more advanced things. So there's the NVRAM monitor. This monitors processors writing to non-volatile RAM. So these are more advanced things, and you've got the kernel module load monitors. It monitors dynamic loading of third-party kernel modules. You can also monitor processors executing out of the user home directory, which would be something definitely unusual. And I'm sure this list of .flock files will increase. So that's a quick overview of the tool. The personal version costs $9, the business version around $20. There is a user guide here at Little Flocker. That's definitely worth downloading and reading so that you can understand it. And this is currently one of the best tools you can get for locking down your Mac at the moment. Protect it against ransomware, spyware, and so on. And finally, I have here for you a collection of random Mac tools that you might find useful. This tool monitors your system for suspicious processors trying to encrypt files to prevent ransomware. This actually wouldn't work for me on a couple of systems. I'm not quite sure why, but in theory, what it says it does is good, so worth checking out. This is Oversight. This is essentially a webcam blocker. It's a tool to stop malware switching on your webcam. And if you remember, there's the same functionality in Little Flocker. This is a dedicated app to do it if you don't go with Little Flocker. Google operates a lot of Macs, and its Macintosh operations team maintains a public repository, open source, of unsupported utilities, tools, scripts, etc. that you actually might find useful. There's a lot of tools in here. So if you've got a Mac looking for admin tools, there's a whole bunch of them from Google here. So check those out. If you want to scan your Mac for applications that are either susceptible to dynamic lib hijacking or have been hijacked, then you can check out this tool here, which is DHS. And if you want to know more about DLL hijacking on macOS, then check out this link here. Let's talk about other relatively new advanced approaches to endpoint protection, which will become the new normal very soon, if not already. The first new approach is the containment approach. We have actually already spoken about the containment approach and products that do that early on in the course when we were talking about isolation and compartmentalization. The containment approach is an isolation and compartmentalization based technology. Products using the containment approach isolate the clean system from potentially malicious files like Office documents, Adobe files, PDFs, scripts, and browser-based content. And these interpreted files can have enough privileges to attack the system or to attack the container using an unpatched or zero-day vulnerability. These files are difficult to detect using a traditional signature-based approach. The containment approach, offered by companies such as Invincia, Bromium, Bufferzone, and Phoronix Deep Freeze, as you can see here, isolate the core system or the clean system from untrusted interpreted code by policy. This approach is similar to the policy-based isolation layer provided by the App Privilege Management System in Android and iOS. And when, for example, you are running a host operating system and a guest operating system as a virtual machine, you are again using the containment approach. But now what we're seeing is attempting to put that into endpoint protection technology and not have to just do it manually ourselves. Another relatively new approach to endpoint protection is deception-based approach like decoy honeypots and servers, honey tokens. These provide early detection of hackers that are already inside your network or already on your system. Elusive Networks, Javelin Networks, Ativo Networks, and Canary Tools, as you can see here, are examples of vendors with solutions that provide these early warnings to you when they can see what's called lateral movement. The lateral movement, this means that the hacker is moving around the network. That's lateral movement. These generally work by presenting something to the hacker that seems worthy of investigation, like a server full of interesting files. But when the attacker starts to look around that server, as an example, then you're alerted to that threat's presence. Later in the course, we cover more on honeypots and deception techniques and detecting hackers' lateral movement and show you how to do that. And another approach, the algorithmic techniques or the machine learning techniques. The security industry sees these as quite strong contenders for this space. Using these methods, they can detect unknown malware or attack techniques without comparing them to a database of known bad artifacts or a blacklist. Algorithmic techniques such as machine learning, also called artificial intelligence, are based not on a database or list of what is known good or bad artifacts, but are based on a computational model that would include characteristics of known good and known bad. Machine learning discovers a detection equation based on predefined datasets, known good and known bad, and it is the equation, not the database traversal, that determines the probability that a new event is good or bad. So let me give you a very basic example of this. The best way to explain this is that the artificial intelligence is almost trying to emulate the thoughts and behaviors and knowledge of a security professional in and when they know what not to click on and why. So let's imagine a person receives an email with an attachment. Already an attachment that's suspicious to the AI. Then the attachment turns out to be an executable file, again adding more suspiciousness to this file. The file is then run by the user and starts to create files in, say, /temp, more suspicious. Then it starts to run encryption routines on files. All of this results in the file being stopped by the AI because based on its artificial intelligence, its machine learning, and how many other malware it's seen act in similar ways, there is a high probability that it believes that this is ransomware. So because of that, it prevents it from doing what it's doing. That is a very basic explanation of the principle. The AI knows the actions of malware that acts similar to that within its database and therefore can identify it as likely to be malware. Cylance and Deep Instinct are representative vendors of this trend towards algorithmic approaches. But these models, this artificial intelligence, requires training, and depending on the vendor, this will be by the user, or models which can be provided to the customer by the vendor based on suitability for the environment, or they can be constantly provided from the vendor, from the cloud, or depends on the approach of the vendor. The products learn from large numbers of malware samples how malware infects machines. Malware tends to use a common set of techniques to infect, and these techniques change actually quite slowly. And malware even borrows code from other malware, making it more likely that the malware is going to perform similar types of actions, which the AI would easily be able to notice as being that of malware. And creating completely new malware using completely new techniques in order to infect is a lot of work for the malware writers, so they try to avoid doing that. But certainly at the moment they do anyway, meaning once the machine learning product learns the current common techniques, it can detect most malware. But the models do need to be fed with the latest malware, obviously, so that they can keep up to date with the latest techniques of infection. If they are not kept up to date, they will not learn the new and crafty techniques that malware will adopt. And of course, malware will adopt new and crafty techniques once the writers start to battle against artificial intelligence. False positives with machine learning are actually an unavoidable side effect because legitimate software such as low-level drivers and some security products can look exactly like malware. So false positives will happen with machine learning, so they will require a little bit of tuning. But a solution that relies solely on machine learning is not necessarily going to be effective against things like fileless malware that often exploits vulnerabilities in common software and uses macros and memory-based attacks to compromise the endpoint. EDR would take over at this point with fileless malware, or another approach like containment would need to take over, where machine learning would not be able to deal with that. This is your layers of defense. This is your defense in depth approach. And the final newish method is behavioral detection and analysis. This has been around for a while. Webroot was one of the pioneers of a dedicated behavioral detection engine, and SentinelOne also continues to refine the technique. But what is new about this is the use of machine learning to identify behavior that is considered a threat. An example being when it sees encrypted communication going out to an unusual port, that might flag as unusual behavior. So there you go, that's a summary of the new endpoint technology controls, or rather the soon-to-be, not new, but the here and now technology of endpoint protection. Of the new vendors for next generation antivirus, I'm actually going to pull out one and discuss them particularly, and that is Cylance, and that's because of the positive feedback that I've heard, and these details are based on the information from Gartner. So Cylance is a next generation AV product. What you can see here is their website and their online offering, and it's definitely one to look out for. They support Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, and it shows impressive results for detecting malware. Cylance replaces the traditional known bad signature database approach found in traditional antivirus products because it uses machine learning or a machine learning algorithm, an approach which we have just mentioned, to inspect file attributes to determine the probability of whether or not it is a malicious file or is of malicious content. The algorithmic approach significantly reduces the endpoint and network resource requirements. Because it is signatureless, it is capable of determining both new threats and new variants of known threats that typically are missed by signature-based techniques. Cylance's approach is disruptive because it does not require signature authors to analyze new threats and codify them in signature updates. It will have improved zero-day malware protection for those looking for low-impact protection for resource-constrained platforms and systems that are disconnected and cannot rely on regular signature updates. So let's look at its strength. The Cylance machine learning algorithm has been demonstrated to be very accurate at detecting new variants and repacked versions of existing malware. Cylance also offers memory injection protection for a number of the most common classes of vulnerabilities, alternative protection techniques such as script control and lockdown. Because the endpoint agent does not require a database of signatures or daily updates, it is extremely lightweight on the network and has a minimal performance impact on endpoints. It can remain effective even when disconnected for long periods. The management console is cloud-based, making it very easy to deploy. However, Cylance does not rely on cloud-based detection, which means protection does not require exfiltration of potentially sensitive files or data to the cloud. Cylance provides file assessment information showing static details on files and global assessment information, including what other customers do with detected files. That is the percentage of other customers that quarantine specific files. Cylance is easily the fastest growing endpoint protection startup in the last 10 years and is gaining traction as an OEM provider for other security solutions such as Dell's Endpoint Security Suite Enterprise and Blue Coat. Some of the Cylance weaknesses now: the Cylance solution provides only anti-malware capabilities. That means that extended endpoint protection functionality such as personal firewalls, URL filtering, port protection, data protection, mobile device protection, enterprise mobility management, vulnerability analysis, endpoint detection and response, EDR, and application control will have to be sourced and managed separately if required. Malware authors develop evasion for most popular anti-malware approaches. As Cylance gains in adoption and market share, its approach will come under more scrutiny from attackers, and bypassers are likely to be developed. But will Cylance be able to cope and counter those methods? The Cylance algorithm can cause false positives, as with any machine learning technology. On less known files that have attributes similar to malware files, especially consumer files, however, evidence reports on convicted files, which includes community ratings and severity scores, should provide sufficient info for admins to whitelist most false positives. Cylance is planning on improving forensic data. The management console is cloud-based, which may not be a desired deployment option for some buyers. There is an absence of regular expressions for memory defense, exclusions, and the need for improved search functionality and agent tamper resistance. And the final weakness is that this is really aimed at the business market, so home users are likely not to be able to take advantage of this, certainly not in its full form anyway. So that's Cylance, a product that is getting a lot of traction in the EPP world at the moment.